For me in the mountains, where walking has a way of pulling you to your peace of mind every day.
Welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall. In this episode, Ryan Jordan and I wrap up the year by chatting about the gear that the Backpacking Light staff and contributors loved in 2021. Now, something important to remember here, that doesn't necessarily mean this gear came out in 2021. Some of the pieces we talk about in this episode are 5, 10, even 15 years old, and we think that's pretty cool. If you're watching the video version of this podcast, be on the lookout for photos of the gear to come up on the screen. Also, make sure and check out the show notes for this episode to find links to all the gear we discuss. All right, settle in and enjoy the episode, everybody. And of course, happy holidays from the Backpacking Light family to yours. We're going to start out with Rex Sanders. Now, some of you listeners might know Rex. He's been on the podcast once to talk about our value ratings and sleeping bags, and he's been doing great work for BPL over the last few years, really digging into technical specs and backpacking standards. He's written a column called Standards Watch, and he's currently doing a huge battery testing article for Backpacking Light, which will come out at the end of the year. So, Ryan, why don't you walk us through what Rex chose?
Rex chose one item in particular that I found intriguing, and that was the Patagonia baggies shorts. But specifically, he noted that he's been wearing shorts that have a 5-inch inseam for many years. Now, 5 inches is not a lot of leg coverage, right? So this is a common length for thru hikers. Rex comes out of this historical long distance hiking culture, and it's really interesting to see that it's so different than some of the trends we've seen in the past few decades, which is towards hiking pants and even longer shorts. And so I'm glad to see Rex still kind of, holding the baton and keeping short shorts in style.
Okay, how about Roger Caffin? Roger lives in Australia. He's another one of our highly technical riders. He's got a very methodical way of approaching the world, and his gear choices are always interesting. So what did Roger choose?
Roger chose pot lifters, and these are something that, I almost never see on gear lists specifically. It's more like, there's a cook kit on your gear list and you're like, okay, I need to throw in my pot lifter. And so Roger actually picked a pot lifter as his choice of a staff pick. And he's using MSR light lifters, which are very, very popular. I've had some experience with, Sulik 46 makes a carbon fiber, really teeny ultralight one that weighs like, a few grams, literally a few grams. And it's great for real tiny pots. And I've used the MSR ones for larger pots. And of course, Roger's cooking for him and his wife, and they're making bigger meals. And so it's probably more appropriate for a larger pot. Definitely one of the best pot lifters on the planet, and has been around for years.
Yeah, and it's something that I don't know that I ever would have gone out and intentionally bought, but MSR tends to throw these into their cook kits. So if you buy a stove and cook kit system, they'll throw one in sometimes. And I actually have found mine to be a way better system than wrapping a bandana around my hand and like trying to grab like a hot pot off of a stove. So it's worth a few ounces, I think. Yeah,
for sure. And I think the MSRs are like 1.1 ounce. They're pretty light. The interesting thing to me is that we look at where ultralight cookware has gone in the past several years, and we've seen the evolution of titanium, thin gauge sheet titanium cookware with really light lids and integrated handles. Do you find that there are situations where you'd prefer a pot lifter over a handle?
Yeah, I think especially if I'm using an alcohol stove or something where the flame tends to flicker a little bit and not just go straight up into the stove. I have I think a Evernew titanium pot, and it had rubberized handles on it. And at some point, my alcohol stove burned those rubberized handles right off. So that's a situation where I would definitely prefer a pot lifter.
Yeah, same with me. And I cook over fire and with a Bush Buddy style stove quite often. And pot lifter is a way better deal than a handle on situations like that.
All right, Jeff de Graffenried is an author that we have that takes really interesting bushwhacking off-trail style trips across national parks in Africa. He's contributed one story for us. He's contributing another as we speak, and he chose a pack for his piece of gear.
And that's the Hyperlite Mountain Gear 2400 Wind Rider. So 2 notes about this pack that I think have made this one of the most popular packs in the ultralight backpacking community. One, it's a pretty durable DCF fabric. It's seam sealed, so you've got a pack that's virtually waterproof. But Jeff's choice is that this is a small size. So they make a 2400, 3400, and a 4400 cubic inch version. But the 2400 is not a very big pack. It's very common among thru hikers, where you're carrying a few days worth of food, so you don't need a lot of volume. Usually you're hiking in temperate seasons. But I don't see this as common with non-thru hiking backpackers. And so I'm always curious to know, what are people's motivations for choosing a pack this small? For me, I like that size because if I'm rock scrambling or bushwhacking, it's just easier to deal with a small pack. And so I was encouraged to see that others are using small packs like this, because it shows that you have some discipline and intention in the gear you're actually trying to put inside it.
Okay, our next author is Iago Vzquez. Now, Iago lives in the Northeast. He does a lot of winter backpacking, and specifically, he does a lot of winter hammock backpacking. So he's kind of our go-to hammock guy when we need some hammock technology reviewed, and he also writes a lot about insulation for us. Now, interestingly enough, none of the things he chose to include on this list are insulation or shelters. So what did he pick?
He picked a SteriPen, which is a water treatment device based on ultraviolet light. I am always intrigued when people have a lot of experience using a SteriPen and still love it. There are a lot of reports of failures of these in the field, and I've analyzed them to the hilt and tried to understand why they fail for certain types of people. And the 2 prevailing failure points are battery decay in cold environments and water ingress into the battery compartment if you have one that uses replaceable batteries versus a UV chargeable solution. So if you can be cognizant of those 2 issues, you can get a lot of mileage out of the SteriPen. And I love them because they are the only foolproof way to inactivate bacteria, viruses, and protozoan cysts, including Giardia and Cryptosporidia, in 60 seconds. And so it is your fastest way to the safest water of any water treatment method out there. I'm a huge fan of SteriPens.
Yeah, what I thought was interesting about Iago's submission is that he talked about using a SteriPen in conjunction with a filter, basically just for extra peace of mind.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting because I've either used a SteriPen in Aquamira or a filter in Aquamira, but I've never used a SteriPen and a filter because I like my backup to be as light as possible. But I think he was going for the maximum peace of mind.
I've guided immunocompromised patients in the past, and we always go with a filter to remove the sediment, because once you remove the sediment, then whatever follow-up treatment becomes much more effective. And then following that, the SteriPen to really disinfect everything.
Our next author is Mark Wetherington. Mark writes a lot about cultural issues for us. He's a librarian in his non-backpacking light life, so he does a lot of backpacking reviews, and he's also an expert gear reviewer, so always interested to see what he chooses. Mark
chose, in general, the Pinnacle Foods brand for freeze-dried meals. And you and I have been looking at a variety of freeze-dried meals for the past several years now, and really taking an in-depth look at backpacking food and nutrition. So whenever I hear of a new brand, I tend to just kind of roll my eyes and think, oh, here's another foodie getting into the backpacking biz, which I understand, but I did not realize how good Pinnacle Foods were until I tried them. Now, you've reviewed them for Backpacking Light, and you're a fan as well. Tell me about your experience with them.
Yeah, so I reviewed them for my big vegetarian and vegan backpacking food roundup, and Pinnacle had just come on the market at the time when I started looking at this last year. They launched with 4 food flavors, and only one of those was a vegetarian meal. I think it was some sort of Thai-based sticky rice dish. But I'm only 75% a vegetarian, so they also sent me one of their non-vegetarian meals, which I happily gobbled up and just did not include in the review. And it was their sausage and biscuits and gravy meal, and it is fantastic. It might be one of the best breakfasts I've ever had out of a bag in the backcountry. Okay, Ben Kilbourne is a native Utahian? How do we say that?
Utopian from Utah.
Utopian from Utah. Ben Kilbourne is from Utah. He writes a lot about Utah. It sort of permeates his writing spiritually. He writes great trip reports and great gear reviews for us. And again, I really respect his voice, so I'm particularly interested in seeing what he has to talk about.
He picked 3 pieces of gear, like most of our staff, but the one that struck out to me was the Cinchi Designs Lark hoodie. So this is a Polartec Alpha Direct mid-layer. Most of the time, Alpha Direct is used as insulation in other layers sandwiched between a shell, like a nylon shell, and then a nylon lining to create an insulated jacket or garment. So a lot of innovative manufacturers are now using Polartec Alpha Direct, which is, I describe it as a fleece mesh. So it's fleecy, it's made of polyester, but there's a very, very much an open weave to it. So if you hold it up to light, lots of light shines through. So what you end up with is a garment that's incredibly light. The Lark in bin size, which is large, is less than 5 ounces. And it's incredibly breathable because of this open mesh structure. And so you can combine it with, your hiking shirt on a chilly morning and not overwhelm yourself with sweat because it breathes so well. Likewise, once you add a shell layer on top of it, I've worn mine with a wind shirt and a rain jacket on top. That fleece, that open fleece, really traps in the heat. And so you create an insulative garment system that's wind and waterproof. And so I think it's an incredibly versatile fabric, and Cinchi does a great job executing it in their hoodies.
And we talked a little bit about Cinchi's products in another podcast, and we'll make sure and drop a link to that in the show notes so you can find it. It's definitely worth a listen. Our next Backpacking Light employee, I will actually let you introduce because you know her quite well. She is Stephanie Jordan.
She is Backpacking Light's co-owner, and the pick I want to highlight from Stephanie is her hat. It's made by a company called Trailheads. The 2 products that Stephanie and I own that we have used more than anything else, more than any other piece of gear over the years, is a hat. Mine has been this crushable Supplex hat that I bought at a craft fair in Big Sky. It has to be almost 20 years ago. Hers is a Trailheads ponytail hat, which is a fleece hat, has a little ponytail hole in the back of it, and then this kind of wraparound closure in the back. And it has become her favorite hat. She's owned it for 17 years, and she refuses to upgrade. And I get it. I love my Supplex hat. She loves her Trailheads hat. But I really wanted to highlight this because there are some pieces of gear that we fall in love with so much that we just can't let go of or replace, in spite of the fact that the outdoor industry recycles designs and fashions and styles and colors every single year. We're starting to see fast fashion come into the outdoor industry. So this is obviously an issue when it comes to environmental sustainability and just consumption in general. And so I'm really proud of her for hanging on to this hat for 17 years.
Okay, Drew Smith is another longtime Backpacking Light contributor. I love Drew's stories. He writes these really interesting, long-form, place-based stories for us that I think just bring a lot of heart and soul into the writing, and you can really get a feel for the places that he's walking through. Drew is also working on a long-term review of a food freeze dryer for backpacking lights. So be on the lookout for a series of articles from Drew coming up in 2022. What did Drew choose, though, for his gear pick?
He chose a Daypack, which is somewhat counterintuitive for a backpacker, but the one he chose is the Sea to Summit Sil Nile Daypack. It's about 2 ounces. This particular product has been around for at least a decade, and he has the original version. I think his is 12 years old or something like that. And so it functions for him as a way to store clothing inside his backpack, and then he uses it for day hiking, either for summit climbing or fishing side trips from a base camp. I see day packs on a lot of our members' gear list now. And I didn't see this too much before, but I see it more now because now Sea to Summit is not the only player in the game. Hyperlite has a DCF day pack. Mm-hmm. Osprey has a gorgeous 3-ounce Sil Nylon day pack out. And so we're starting to see that we can use these inside our big packs as stuff sacks to store sleeping bag and clothing and things like that. And then we have a much more functional backpack for short day trips from base camp rather than emptying everything out of our big pack and using that as a day pack, which can be kind of cumbersome sometimes depending on what you're doing. But granted, I will acknowledge that day packs for ultralighters, it's been a long time coming. They discarded them and said, hey, we'll just use our big pack. And that worked for a while, but now we have all these options less than, about 4 ounces that serve as really good stuff sacks inside your pack and pretty good day packs outside.
Well, Ryan, you and I talk about gear a lot on the podcast. So is there anything you've experimented with, played around with in the last year that you haven't already mentioned?
Yes, I went on a trip this year. I do a trip every year with a couple families that are friends of ours, and they bring a whole bunch of kids. And it's always a long trip, 8, 9, sometimes 10 days, and often without resupply, often off trail, remote wilderness areas. So the challenge with hiking with young children, especially, and I'm thinking 7 to 12 years old, is finding a good lightweight pack that fits them. This year, we put all the kids in ULA Equipment Spark Kids backpacks. They were absolutely fantastic. I was blown away. We've used Deuter, we've used Osprey, we've used some custom ones in the past, but the kids Spark out of ULA just nailed it on every perspective. They had adjustable torso, so we could really dial in the fit. They carried the weight well. The kids never complained about their discomfort on shoulder straps or hip belts, and they completely dialed it in. We had 4 kids carry these, and they were ages 8 to 11 on our trip, and I was just really impressed with this particular product. Obviously, one I can't test myself, but putting 4 of these in the hands of kids and spending 8 days with them in the Bighorns of Wyoming was review enough for me, and just watching them really enjoy using these packs.
Awesome. That's sure to be a useful tool. We also have a podcast that we did specifically on backpacking for families and with children, and we'll also put a link to that in the show notes as well for other tools and tricks on that particular aspect of our sport.
All right, Andrew, let's close this segment with you. What has been your favorite piece of gear of the year?
Well, I will spare listeners any more talking about my Bears Ears pack, since I feel like I've mentioned that like 9 times in the last year. I want to talk about Outdoor Herbivore, which is another company that I discovered in the course of testing for my big gear roundup. Outdoor Herbivore is, all their meals are vegan, so they cover sort of the vegetarian and vegan side of things just by default. And they're pretty small packaged, pretty tasty. But what I really want to highlight about them is that they ship next day after your order. And to me, what that means is that when I need packaged food, it tends to be short notice. I don't have time to get out the dehydrator or go to the grocery, like try to pull it all together. If I have a trip coming up in a week and I want packaged food, and I need food, that's when I ordered packaged food. But I live in the middle of nowhere. It's hard for me to get to a big box store and buy stuff. So if I can go to Outdoor Herbivore, click my order, it's going to be on my doorstep in the next 2 days. And that's just standard practice for them. And I think that's really useful.
And remarkable in the context of all the supply chain logistical delays we've had during the pandemic. And just everybody's been out of food. It's packaged food has been hard to get. And so to see these guys kind of just do the exact opposite and make sure you get your food quick is pretty awesome.
All right, well, we're going to wrap this up. We have tons more content from all of these authors and others that we haven't even mentioned that is all published in the Gear We Love Gear Guide. We'll definitely put a link to that in the show notes so that you can find it. Definitely worth checking out. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Backpacking Light podcast. The Backpacking Light podcast is advertising free, thanks to the membership fees paid by Backpacking Light members. A BackpackingLight.com membership gives you access to 20 years of archives, forums, and online courses. And don't forget, if you're an unlimited member, you'll get the video version of this podcast for free as a part of your membership. So please consider supporting this podcast and become a member right now at BackpackingLight.com/membership.
You can download the show notes for this episode at backpackinglight.com/podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review. It does help other people find the show.
Thanks for listening to the Backpacking Light podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall.
And I'm Ryan Jordan. And if we can leave you with one parting message, it's this: pack less, be more, because lighter is better. Happy trails, everybody.
So I shoulder my backpack, walk away from the car.